In one of the biggest political comebacks of all time, Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States. Now, despite polls showing him neck and neck with his Democratic rival Kamala Harris, it ended with a very convincing win for the Republican. What now lies ahead for America and the rest of the world? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, it's time to unite. President-elect Donald Trump declared this in his victory speech after winning an historic second term. Taken to the stage in Florida as he claimed the US presidency, Mr. Trump was surrounded by his family, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, and had spent election night with the billionaire Elon Musk, who he referenced in his speech. Trump promised to heal America and make it great again. Kamala Harris accepted the result and pledged to keep fighting.
I will govern by a simple motto: promises made, promises kept. We're going to keep our promises. Nothing will stop me from keeping my word to you, the people. We will make America safe, strong, prosperous, powerful, and free again. And I'm asking every citizen all across our land to join me in this noble and righteous endeavor. That's what it is. It's time to put the divisions of the past 4 years behind us. It's time to unite.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright. As long as we never give up, and as long as we keep fighting.
So what does a second Trump presidency look like, and how will it impact relations with the EU and the UK? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Adam Boulton, the British journalist and broadcaster. Simon Toubeau is Assistant Professor in Politics and International Relations at Nottingham University. And the Economist, Vicky, Pyrce. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Adam, I'll come to you first. He's back. He's got a bigger mandate. Will he be different this time round?
Yeah, I think he'll certainly be different because by now he's a professional politician. He's been campaigning. He's got through an awful lot of staff. He's now got staff around him who pretty much see things his way. And so we won't have, with this presidency, this talk about adults in the room restraining Donald Trump. Of course, he's also 8 years older than when he was elected and approaching 80. So I think there has to be some question as to how much of his presidency will be performative and how much of it will actually be delivering on some of the wilder things which he has talked about, including for us in Europe and around the world, this talk about really heavy tariffs, for example, on trade. And similarly, we don't really know which way he's going to go on the major conflicts in the world. We know that he's someone who didn't get America into wars when he was president last time round, was quite conflict averse. At the same time, he has boasted that he can end the war in Ukraine, that he can sort out the Middle East. And very interesting that his first phone call was to Bibi Netanyahu. And that has real implications for how far Israel goes. I mean, the implication seems to be he wants the immediate fighting to be over by the time he's inaugurated on the 20th of January. But both he and Netanyahu are talking more about doing something about Iran. And so, which would very much multiply the conflict. And similarly, when we got to the question of Ukraine, been a perception that he might try that he will try and use his friendship with Putin to get him to get some territorial concessions and therefore end the war. But it doesn't seem likely that that's going to be acceptable to Putin. And it may be, some are saying in Washington, that the corollary of that will actually be strengthening Zelensky, who also was quick to congratulate him on leadership on the basis that Putin has has defied him, and the only other way to end the war is for Ukraine to prevail.
Simon, from your discussions in the last 48 hours across Europe, what are people saying in the big cities?
Well, I think the major concern is with the unpredictability of Trump's behavior and the tendency towards isolationism, which is going to characterize his foreign policy, and the fact that that's going to rattle transatlantic relations. So I think there's a bit of concern on that front. On the other hand, Trump is not an unknown quantity. We know who he is, we know what his agenda is, we know what his priorities are, and European leaders have dealt with him before. So I think that maybe that familiarity is going to be helpful in trying to steer him in a direction that's a little bit more cooperative on some of those big issues, including trade and including the conflict in Ukraine. So I think that that's going to be something that is going to be at the advantage of European leaders.
Vicky, let's talk economics. He has promised big, as he always does. How can he get the American economy moving, first of all?
Well, the American economy is moving. So that's the thing that we mustn't forget, that yes, of course, people voted on the economy, but they had forgotten that actually they had been growing a lot faster than all the other industrialized nations, except very recently Spain, which of course has now been hit by all this flood, so who knows. But we have had the US being able to survive through COVID in a reasonable way and getting out of the problems of year one of COVID, 2020, much faster than anyone else, except, of course, China. And that is, down to Biden, frankly. Now, how can he better that? It's just true that, of course, inflation went up very significantly during the COVID period and after that because of the energy crisis that we had, the war in Ukraine. But in reality, there is already growth in the economy. Slowing down a bit, there's no doubt about that, which would have happened anyway. It happens actually right now to be the case in Europe as well. So what can he do to get the economy to do better than what has been happening just recently? Well, what he wants to do is protect the US even more than has been the case already. Because
America first.
Well, yes, Biden's policies have been very protectionist. If you look at the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, tons of money, trillions being spent on this, subsidizing the US industry, encouraging firms to come in and invest in the US, and therefore shutting out as much as possible China and others. So what he can do a bit more. The question is, what is he going to do with the IRA? Well, with a bit of luck, he'll leave it there, but he will reinforce it by imposing bigger tariffs on China and also tariffs again on a number of products that had gone down a bit recently on European products. And that's going to be a big issue. Yes, of course, it's possible that indeed the European leaders will find that there is a way of discussing things and getting arrangements with Trump. They've been trying to do a trade deal with the US, which nobody was interested in. Maybe this is the time to think about it. But I'm suspecting that Trump will expect many more concessions from the Europeans than he'll be prepared to give himself.
Adam, on Roundtable previously, you've described Trump as a transactional president and politician. What will he want from the UK?
Praise and support is what he'll want from the UK. And, interestingly, whatever he decides to do in foreign policy, he may well use the threat of tariffs as a way to get people to support him. My own view is that both main political parties here tend to overdo the special relationship and tend to suck up. And we already heard Keir Starmer going on about the diplomatic brilliance of having a 2-hour lunch with Trump, a dinner with Trump before the election. As the Americans like to say, that and 25 cents will buy you a phone call. I mean, the truth is, talk to most previous ambassadors and they say, look, this relationship has been entirely in terms of what we can mutually get out of it. Of course, in security and intelligence, there is intense cooperation. But then that's to the United States' benefit as well as ours. So my feeling is the UK does look a little bit isolated at the moment because it's not in the European bloc. It's not in the American bloc. And America First does mean repatriating jobs. Now, according to British statistics, we actually have a trade surplus with the United States. According to the United States, we don't. But if I was advising the Treasury, I wouldn't boast too much about having a trade surplus with the United States, because that will simply encourage Trump's financial advisors to say, well, how can we get more of particularly these financial and legal services repatriated to the United States?
Simon, just on that point about Britain being isolated, I mean, this would have been a very good time to be a member of the European Union.
Yeah, indeed. I think Britain is a little bit out in the cold right now. It doesn't have, in the United States, a partner that is looking to open its trade borders and to provide it with the kind of deal that it needs to replace the free trade arrangement and the single market arrangement it had with the European Union. So I think that at the moment that's going to be difficult. It may be that Trump sees the UK as a kind of bridge to the European Union, especially on security matters. It may be that with things like the conflict in Ukraine, the reshaping of NATO, and the increase of European states' responsibility over their own security, he can use the relationship with the United Kingdom to try and shape the nature of the debate on that issue within Europe, and to try and get all European countries to, well, just take more responsibility for that.
Vicky, 8 years on from the Brexit vote, still no sign of a trade deal with the US for the United Kingdom. What does Trump's victory mean for that? Is it dead in the water, or will he dangle that carrot in front of Starmer?
He might. I mean, the question is, how important does he think that the UK is? He's got other things to worry about. And the UK has tried with various presidents to have a trade deal, but so has the EU, and they haven't quite succeeded because there are a number of things that they would have to put up with, which they don't really want to, particularly on the agricultural side. But there are many other areas. I mean, Adam spoke about the trade deficit. I mean, we do sell quite a lot of services to the US, and it is absolutely true that the US has a big stake in terms of industry here in the UK. Something like 700 billion worth of investments which have been made here by the US, which are there, and therefore they need to have a reasonable return. And if, for whatever reason, the UK doesn't do well in the future, then those firms will also suffer that have invested quite heavily over here. So there is an interest in ensuring that at least there is some deal. And I'm pretty certain that the UK, in fact, there was already some mentioned by Rachel Reeves about looking quite carefully at what maybe those tariffs would be, and keeping an open mind of what would happen. There may be an interest in doing a special deal with the UK, but I think the UK, just as has just been said, would be considerably stronger in getting closer to Europe. And I think in some ways, perhaps the Trump election is good news from that point of view. We've all been waiting for Starmer to do something more, except he talks about defence, possibly, but a lot more needs to be done in terms of the trade agreement that we have with Europe and getting much closer to them, because I think right now we're going to have the US protectionist, we have China doing its own thing, and then Europe trying quite desperately to find a position in the middle, with all sorts of reports being done by Draghi and others to improve its competitiveness, getting closer together and so on. We can't be left outside when all these things are happening, because you just lose out, unless you become, like has been said before, Singapore by the Thames. But that's not really what the UK is trying to do.
Adam, just on that point, I mean, is this an interesting side effect of Trump's victory, that Keir Starmer will now think, well, we need to be closer to Europe?
Not much sign of it at the moment. Before we knew that Trump had won. And it is possible, I think, that in the political climate in this country, and indeed in Europe, it could go the other way. That one of the things we know from this election result is that a significant portion of the American electorate weren't bothered by the niceties of respecting democracy and all that. And opinion polls show that even amongst young voters, there's a significant minority, maybe about 40%, who will say they would like to see a strong leader who would put the nation first. And it is in a kind of beggar my neighbour sense of America first, or Britain first, or France first. So I think it's equally possible, if Trump is deemed to be successful, that he could actually energise more nationalistic parties across Europe, including in the United Kingdom. We're already seeing, the new Conservative leader raising this matter at question time of just how close we are to the Americans in attitude. So it may be that, half the country will say, well, the obvious solution is to get closer to Europe, but the other half may well say the obvious solution is to behave more like Donald Trump. And certainly you've got already British politicians like the ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson and indeed Nigel Farage, who's gone out to Florida saying that. So I don't think we should necessarily feel that our politics is isolated from the currents. Quite a lot of people actually think, good on Trump, he's shown that he's a strong man, and we should, if only we had our own Trump.
Simon, talk to me about the knock-on effect then in Europe for some of the far-right politicians, because this will no doubt be a shot in the arm for them.
Yeah, I think that they're definitely there's a wave that is characterizing the rise of populist nationalist politicians in the United States and in Europe. They've risen in strength at the same time. But the sources of their support are due to domestic consideration and domestic politics. It's domestic grievances. In Germany, they had a lot of grievances over the introduction of house pumps for housing, for the heating of houses, rather than the existing boilers, right? So that was at the basis of a lot of support for the alternative for Deutschland, right? So I think it's domestic considerations, dissatisfaction with existing governments and their performance in dealing with economic and social problems. So I think that definitely their support is much more due to domestic reasons. But it's true that what this does is to do two things. It legitimates a narrative. It's the narrative of putting a country's interests first. It's the narrative of wanting to take firm decisions and firm actions against very persistent problems like immigration and the crime associated with the smuggling of migrants. So that's the other one. And then the third potential, let's say, ripple effect would be to do with the kind of policies that are undertaken with regards to the treatment of migrants, for example. So increasing securitization of borders. That has already happened in Germany, a reintroduction of border controls, even from other European countries. Greater checks and more onerous checks with regards to legal migration would be another policy. And then the third one that we're seeing in Europe and in the United States is the extraterritorialization of asylum claims. So having asylum seekers and their claims being dealt with by third countries. And I think that that's definitely something that we're going to see ripple through the rest of the European countries.
Vicky, we saw Elon Musk take a big role in terms of being around Trump, this friendship. They're clearly politically very aligned. Do you think there's a role for Elon Musk in any kind of Trump cabinet or administration?
Well, there's already been some suggestion that he will be in charge possibly of some department that's going to achieve efficiencies and basically sack lots of people who don't need to be there because it can all be done a lot better. So who needs civil servants? As an ex-civil servant, of course, I worry whenever I hear anything like that. But as far as the UK is concerned, and Elon Musk, I mean, remember, he was not invited specifically to the big investment summit that the Labour Party had soon after they got elected, well, just a few weeks ago. So I don't really know what he will be suggesting if he becomes even more powerful as a result of this, because, of course, he has been very much working with Trump through this, particularly in the later stages.
Is this a concern for the UK then, that, if Musk is persona non grata in London and suddenly he's like Trump's right-hand man almost?
Well, possibly, but I think, views change. I mean, people said all sorts of things about Trump, which they're now eating up as quickly as they possibly can, trying to forget in order to deal with him. So hopefully it's not going to be doing long-term damage. But there are all sorts of things, of course, that he would be interested in, as Elon Musk himself. His own firm, Tesla, and competition from China. So part of the tariff situation we might see may well reflect that. But of course, the Europeans would be quite worried about all this because, do they do the same thing, or are they going to find that they get dumped with all those products that were going to be sold to the US before and now come here? There has been a concern all along, particularly with the tariffs that already have been imposed on electric vehicles. What will happen to European industry? And also any deregulation that may happen in the States, the fact that taxes are meant to be coming down for corporates. All that is going to be, quite an area of concern to see how you can become competitive. Just quickly, the idea that the UK by itself can repeat and do what Trump is doing when we have low growth, we don't have enough investment happening in this country, and the likelihood of attracting a lot of that extra investment is not that great. To be able to just go it alone and be competitive ourselves and just close our own borders, that's for the birds, really. It just cannot happen.
Adam, talk to me about Nigel Farage, because he was off to that victory party like a rocket, wasn't he, the other night? Where does he fit in now in terms of, will he become Trump's go-to man in the UK?
Well, possibly. I mean, we don't know the extent. I mean, Nigel Farage describes Trump as a personal friend. I don't know if he's even seen him in spite of going to Florida. Didn't seem to be much evidence when he was over at the convention that he did, but he's certainly modelling himself on Trump and saying that, he would be the person who should be Britain's person to talk to the Trump administration. Even some people have talked about making him the British ambassador. Now, none of that is clearly going to happen, but his party now has MPs in Parliament, and Nigel Farage is a charismatic figure. I mean, he's not as charismatic as either Trump or Boris Johnson, but nonetheless, probably of our British political leaders, he is the best, communicator on television and all his views. So he's not going to go away. And I agree with Vicky that trying to emulate the United States would be ridiculous. But Britain does seem to be very needy and trying to suck up and say we're the ones with the special relationship. We won 2 world wars together and all the rest of it is something that appeals across the political spectrum.
Simon, talk to me about Ukraine and Gaza. Trump has said that no wars on his watch. I mean, can we expect movement in the next few days and weeks?
Yeah, so I think that what this will do is it will force a reckoning with reality, especially I think in Ukraine, but also in Gaza. The reality in Ukraine is that the war hasn't really changed in the last 18 months. It's a frozen conflict. There's been no movement on either side. And I think that what this will do is it will force the European leaders and Zelensky to recognize that fact on the ground. And I think that what you're likely to see is an attempt to try and foster maybe a truce, maybe some peace talks, perhaps some kind of negotiation, in which there's a quid pro quo, in which the territorial gains that have been made by Russia following its invasions are recognized in exchange for some kind of security guarantee, the nature of which I don't really know, could be in NATO or maybe even outside NATO, but some kind of inclusion in a security umbrella. I think most European leaders probably think this already in private, but haven't had either the courage or the honesty to foist this onto the Ukrainian leaders. They've said, the timing is up to you. I think here the timing is going to be accelerated as a result of this election. And if Trump is not able to determine the timing in a way that suits him, he will use the withholding of weaponry and support as leverage. So I think that that's the direction in which things are going. And I think that the European nations within NATO will come out strengthened out of this conflict. They're already strengthened as a result of their increasing preparedness for hostilities coming from Russia. And I think that they're probably following a lot of what Trump wanted them to do anyway in his previous administration. In terms of Gaza, I don't see much movement in terms of the way in which European leaders will position themselves towards it, mainly because they've been quite absent. I mean, they've made a lot of public declarations, but their influence has been very, very little. And indeed, even the US president's influence has been quite limited. So, I don't see much change there. Israel has talked about having, more of a free hand, but I haven't seen Israel's hand being too constrained so far.
I think the real change will be that Trump believes he has a close relationship with Saudi Arabia, and clearly I think it's likely that a settlement in the Middle East with Saudi Arabian involvement will become much more likely. It's sort of sat back from the conflict so far, but I think we'll probably see a Trump administration seeking...
Reach out to them.
Yeah.
Final point to you, Vicky. Do you think he'll turn off the financial taps of support for Ukraine?
It's entirely possible. It all depends, of course, what happens with the Congress and whether it turns Republican or not. We don't have the results yet, I don't think, in terms of constraint, therefore, on what he might do. But if it was up to him, I would suspect that he would.
Vicky, Adam and Simon, thank you all so much. Whatever happens, it's going to be very, very interesting. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.